We need to talk about pyroclastic flows, fast-moving, burning hot clouds of gas, smoke, lumps of rock, pumice and ash. The technical name for them is pyroclastic density currents, and they can travel along the surface at anything up to 300 kilometers per hour or 200 miles per hour. Notable historical examples of devastating pyroclastic flows include Vesuvius near Napoli in AD 79, Mount Pelée in Martinique in 1902, Nova Rupta in Alaska in 1912, Mount St. Helens, Washington State, 1980, Pinatubo in the Philippines in 1991, and Fuego in Guatemala, 2018. These lethal clouds are common in explosive eruptions and can have several causes. A lateral blast from the side of a cone. This was what happened to Mount St. Helens. Frothing of gas-laden magma as it spews out at the surface. Nova Rupta's 1912 eruption produced this effect. Collapse of the eruption column. The ejected material that's denser than air comes crashing back to Earth, blasting out laterally as it hits the ground. Vesuvius in AD 79 was a good example. The sudden rupture of a lava dome, a lava bulge at the surface. In 1991, Mount Unzen in Japan had pyroclastic flows resulting from a dome collapse. 43 people died, including volcanologists Katia and Maurice Kraft. You may remember from last time several fishermen from Sabisi visited Krakatau and found what they thought to be the beach erupting. When the local Dutch controller and his senior visited the island, they saw evidence that supported this observation. However, if there had been fissures on the coast of Krakatau, the eruption might have progressed rather differently. A more probable explanation for the erupting beach is pyroclastic flow activity. When the Governor-General Loudon sailed across to the islands in May, a week after Krakatau's opening salvo, its passengers found thousands of trees stripped of branches and bark. This is a very typical sign of pyroclastic density currents. The Sabisi fishermen had reported a series of loud bangs, followed by smoke and debris at the beach. If they were present when pyroclastic flows were thundering down to the beach, then they were extremely lucky to have dodged them and escaped alive. In 2019, a small explosive eruption of Whakaari, a volcanic island off the coast of North Island, New Zealand, caught a group of volcano tourists that had just landed for a visit. This eruption involved only mild pyroclastic flows, and yet there were 22 fatalities and 25 other casualties, some with life-altering injuries.
Oh my God.
We rejoin our story in the latter half of June 1883. In the 3 weeks prior, not much was recorded about what happened. Whilst it's unlikely that Krakatau's activity died down completely in this gap, it's entirely possible that the eruption had subsided enough for it to have become routine to the locals. Volcanoes don't conform to Hollywood-style patterns of behaviour. They aren't neat and tidy, nor do they follow a predictable schedule of activity. They are capricious, full of false starts and fake endings. They can arrive unannounced in the night, stop the next morning, or keep grumbling on for months and years, something very well illustrated by the intermittent but ongoing eruptions near Grindavik in Iceland. At any rate, before we get into Krakatau's worsening eruption cycle, let me introduce you to a Dutch mining engineer called Verbeek. He had been stationed in the region from 1867 and had mapped Krakatau's geology in 1880. He had also previously conducted bathymetry of the Sunda Strait, in other words, marine surveys of the area. When the volcano erupted, Verbeek was actually resident in Batavia, so his background and his presence there made him the obvious choice for the Dutch government to send. He got to work very quickly and produced an interim report just 6 months after the eruption. His full monograph eventually ran to 546 pages. It came out in 1885 and was a highly revealing and comprehensive report of this eruption and its aftermath. Although not formally a geologist, Verbeek's familiarity with the region and his comparison data from before and after the eruption made his work invaluable. It's entirely thanks to Verbeek that subsequent investigations have had so much data upon which to build, and his findings and observations are still cited today. It would not be an exaggeration to say that Roger Verbeek's work was the genesis of volcanology as a science in its own right. As we returned to the action in the latter half of June, the situation was clearly not getting any better. Krakatau's eruption column was reaching 4 to 5 kilometers into the air, and what had been the summit of the lowest lying cone, Perbuatan, had gone. From this point on, the seas became rougher and more unpredictable, and the volcano itself was regularly reminding everyone of its presence. The magma mixing I discussed in part 1 was starting to produce an almost continuous eruption, and even if its noise ebbed and flowed, it was now depositing huge pumice rafts into the Indian Ocean, which in some cases were drifting thousands of kilometers. This would be a good time to look at some of the eruption products that enable volcanologists and geologists to decipher what a volcano is doing. In Krakatau's magma mixing, we had magma composed mainly of dacite, which tends to be thick and viscous, interacting with much hotter and thinner magma made of basalt. Basalt is present in the vast majority of volcanic eruptions. The presence of rock strata containing a mixture of dacite and basalt was how in more recent years it was discovered that Krakatau was ejecting mixed magma. When discussing pyroclastic flows, we need to know a little about something called ignimbrite. Ignimbrite is very important to our story because it's a signature product of pyroclastic flows. It can tell us when Krakatau produced pyroclastic flows and how extensive they were. Ignimbrite is often a very rough mixture of ash and pumice. Ignimbrites can be loose or solid and come in a range of colours depending on their mineral composition. What we call volcanic ash isn't like ash from a bonfire or fireplace. It's actually very fine, porous, glass-like particles. The distinction between ash and pumice is only one of size. The presence of ignimbrite on the ocean floor surrounding Krakatau was confirmed by Dr. Charles Mandeville, a volcanologist and geochemist. In the late 1970s, he dived to the ocean floor of the Sunda Strait and discovered the true cause of the massive tsunamis that accompanied the paroxysmal phase of the eruption. More of this later, but suffice to say that even though there were many large explosions, Krakatau didn't just blow up and vanish. The volcano ejected so much mass into the air that it was always going to come back down again. Mandeville's work confirmed that there had been multiple collapses of the eruption column and that these had impacted the surrounding ocean, causing the deadly waves that destroyed huge areas of local coastline and killed tens of thousands. Although the news about Krakatau spread around the world quite quickly, The earliest accounts of what happened were compiled from eyewitnesses and whatever data had been collected at the time and in the years immediately following this eruption. These eyewitnesses have enabled a sequence of events to be put together. But when it came to the geological processes in play, the extreme danger of being anywhere near the island, plus the intermittent lack of visibility due to ash and other airborne emissions, it was often impossible to see precisely what was happening on the island. Thankfully, the geological record contains many of the clues we need, and it's from this that volcanologists have been able to produce theories of what happened to Krakatau and how. It was Verbeek who initially put forward the idea that this violent eruption may have been caused by the ingress of seawater into the volcano's magma chamber. As the island had apparently collapsed into the sea, it wasn't unreasonable for Verbeek to suggest that a lot of seawater might have come into contact with magma and perhaps caused the huge explosions on the 27th of August. As covered in part 1 of this series, such events are known as phreatomagmatic eruptions. This hypothesis persisted well into the 20th century and is the explanation offered by Rupert Furneaux in his 1964 book Krakatoa. Although some water must have come into contact with the magma chamber when the island collapsed, it has since been established that none of the deposits from the 1883 eruption contain the fine-grained ashes that typify water-magma interaction. As June ended, the eruption now became more prevalent and more continuous. Like many other volcanoes, the intensity of Krakatau's activity over the next few weeks would rise and fall. But by the end of the month, the eruption column was easily topping 20 kilometers, and it was somewhere in here that the summit of Perbuatan collapsed. "160+ years after this disaster, we already know what the outcome would be. Officially, some 36,000 dead, but likely many more, and an equally huge number of injuries. The 21st century has already seen several tsunamis, including one from Anak Krakatau itself in 2018, so images like these continue to haunt us. Homes destroyed, farms obliterated, families torn apart, children orphaned, businesses and livelihoods ended. But whilst deeply concerning, in July of 1883, the incessant noise and earth tremors, the towering pillars of smoke and deposits of ash, mud and pumice also came to acquire a certain nuisance value. Nobody alive at that time understood where this eruption was headed, and volcanology as a science simply didn't exist. One account speaks of a Dutch colonial lady being irritated by the constant window rattling, rumblings and distant explosions because she couldn't properly listen to a musical recital she was attending. Krakatau didn't obligingly go silent after dark either, so insistent and increasingly violent bursts of noise were a perpetual background to life on the Sunda Strait. Those living near the mainland coastlines and those on other islands were constantly disturbed by fresh bouts of eruptive noise. At night, Krakatau's emissions were even more clearly lit up both by their own heat and by volcanically induced lightning. And in various locations there was the intermittent pelting of roofs by falling pumice. Despite all this, however, people stayed put. As July wore on, Krakatau's eruption plume was, on average, somewhat lower than it had been at the end of June. It's therefore conceivable that, unaware of the truly dire nature of what was to come, many inhabitants felt that surely this must all eventually die down. And let's not forget that Indonesia is the most volcanic and seismically active area in the world. So maybe to the locals this was just a slightly more irritating case of business as usual. Amongst the Indonesians themselves there was a mixture of views. Many recognized the ongoing eruption as simply a natural sequence of events. Others attributed it to supernatural causes such as angry deities or spirits. and amongst some of the Muslim population this was a sign of divine anger over the lack of stout resistance to Dutch colonial rule of the country. This only stoked the wish to expel the Dutch from Indonesia, something which would indeed transpire a few years after the eruption. One thing was certain though, change was happening and human geography would, as ever, be at the mercy of physical geography. When it concerns volcanoes, this carries particular poignance. A key element in understanding the nature of this eruption is knowing about the column and the cloud that it produced. It's long been thought that Krakatau's eruption column and that of Pinatubo in 1991 have plenty in common. In their formation, they are both what's known as Plinian. This term goes back to the eruption of Vesuvius in AD 79, as observed by the Roman lawyer and writer Pliny the Younger. Writing about his uncle Pliny the Elder, who perished in the eruption, he said Vesuvius's eruption column had the form of a pine tree. This would be the Mediterranean stone pine, which has a thick, very tall trunk extending upwards to a broad canopy. Plinian is volcanological shorthand for an eruption column shaped in this way. Pliny the Younger also witnessed what we now recognize as pyroclastic flows streaming down the sides of Vesuvius. Pinatubo's eruption in 1991 was Plinian. Krakatau started out sub-Plinian, but progressed to straight-out Plinian as its paroxysmal phase developed. So, what does the shape of the eruption cloud and the style of the eruption have to do with pyroclastic flows? Pyroclastic flows don't develop out of nothing. Something has to trigger them, and in Krakatau's instance, eruption column collapse featured prominently. A much debated theme with Krakatau of 1883 is what caused the biggest explosions and what caused the tsunamis. A crucial clue lies in the submarine deposits of ignimbrite found after the eruption. The explosions were likely caused by huge pulses of magma ejected violently upwards. As for the tsunamis, there can come a point when the expulsion of material at the surface pauses or stops altogether. Gravity takes over and those parts of the eruption column which are denser than air come hurtling back down again. This is why Charles Mandeville's work on the ocean floor of the Sunda Strait was so important. The water is only about 40 meters deep there, and Mandeville found abundant ignimbrite all over the seabed. This evidence supported the idea that the tsunamis were caused by pyroclastic activity. Huge amounts of volcanic ejecta falling back down and slamming into the sea. While many coastal areas were devastated by waves, one location also suffered a direct hit by a pyroclastic flow. This was the fate of Ketimbang, the town administered by Willem Berink. Ketimbang was on Sumatra, some 38 kilometers from Krakatau. Many inhabitants had already fled for higher ground, but 2,000 souls were not so lucky. So great are the temperatures and the suddenness of such a cloud's arrival that one can only hope the end was quick for those people. Of those who did successfully escape Ketimbang, many still suffered severe burns and other injuries. The Berinks fled up the slopes of nearby Rajabasa and were still affected by the pyroclastic flow. Joanna was seared by hot gas and would later describe how, most likely in shock, she observed with some detachment that pieces of her own skin were hanging off. The dust and poisonous gases probably also caused the death of her baby. Krakatau was to heap tragedy upon tragedy. Some like this would be recorded, others lost forever. Pyroclastic flows are dangerous enough on land, but when they meet the ocean their passage is greatly facilitated by the water. The scalding hot gas produces a cushion of steam, which allows the flow to ride further and faster than it otherwise might. The heavier debris sinks to the ocean floor, leaving the lighter and hotter constituents to shoot out at tremendous speed. For simplicity, I've so far shown the ocean around Krakatau as mostly just water. However, by the time this cataclysm ended, whole tracts of the Sundar Strait were heaving with pumice, ash, trees, debris from smashed buildings, destroyed boats, the carcasses of dead animals and fish, and the bodies of thousands of people. A macabre and terrifying sight not easily forgotten. According to Krakatau 1883, a definitive tome published for the centennial of the eruption, by the 12th of August, Danam had partially collapsed. Perbuatan's cone had already gone by this point, and it's likely that by the time events reached a climax, the whole northern end of the island was just a series of gaping holes, spewing forth the contents of the magma chamber. The stage is now set for the dreadful events of the 26th and 27th of August 1883. In the final part of this series, we'll see just what kind of hell Krakatau would unleash.